Thank you. It was a surprise. I'm glad to be here, and I've been asked to say a little something about how the war on drugs started, which I know a lot about. You see, in my 26 years in the New Jersey State Police, I did 14 years undercover in narcotics. I started my undercover work at the beginning of the war on drugs. That was 1970. And I can tell you the war on drugs has nothing to do with drugs. It was started by Richard Nixon, and it had everything to do with the fact that he was running for the presidency for the second time, and this time he thought it'd really be nice to win. Now, he knew if he was a strong anti-crime guy, it'd give him a lot of votes, but boy, if he could just talk about drugs and crime, how those votes would pour in. So he started the war on drugs, and he was right, he was elected. In his first year in office, he got the U.S. Congress to pass massive funding bills that would give tremendous amounts of money to any police department willing to hire officers to fight his war on drugs. Give you an idea how huge these were, in my organization, we went from a 7-man narcotic unit to a 76-person narcotic bureau overnight, all paid for by the federal government. We increased the number of cops doing this one job by 11 times its size. And this was replicated across the United States. Now, any of you that know about administration know that you increase the size of a group doing one job by 11 times its size. In the coming year, we were expected to make at least 11 times more arrests than we did the year before. And we were literally off to the races. I was one of those 76 troopers that came in to be a narc. After 2 weeks training, they lined us up and said, count off 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Every third person became an undercover agent. I happened to be a 3, and that's where I spent most of the next 14 years of my life. We really didn't have much of a drug problem at all in the United States in 1970. What little drug problem we did have was mainly soft drugs, drugs like marijuana, hashish, some LSD, psilocybin, the mushrooms, the mind-bending drugs. The hard drugs like heroin, cocaine, methamphetamine were practically unheard of in 1970, certainly unheard of compared to what they are today. To find a real drug dealer, you had to go to the biggest cities back then. We didn't have drug dealers in every city or in every town or suburb. And if you go back and look at the statistics from 1970, you'll find that the likelihood of anybody dying that year as a result of the drug culture was less than the likelihood of them dying from falling down the steps in their own house. It was less than the likelihood of them choking to death on their own food at dinner, but we started a war on drugs. We had 25 undercover agents. As I said, you had to go to the biggest cities to find a drug dealer. And since we were working the suburbs, I was about 20 miles out of New York City, they didn't target us on drug dealers. There weren't any out there. They targeted us on small friendship groups of young people, people in college, people in high school, people in between. And when we became their friends, come Friday night, they're out of school, they're off work, somebody might say, hey, you want to get high tonight? And if nobody said that, that was my job. And if anybody took me up on that offer, then one of the friends who happened to have access to the family car or some other way to get to the city would go around to the friends and say, hey, you want to get high tonight? Some would say, I'm studying for a test, I'll catch you next time. Others would say, yeah, while you're in the city, pick me up a couple joints. Somebody else might say, hey, I hear there's some really good blotter acid out there. If you run across any blotter acid while you're in the city, give me a hit, 1 dose of blotter acid. We're talking maybe $5 worth of drugs. When they'd come to me, I'd put my order in for this same tiny little bit of drugs. Off they'd go to the city, they'd buy this stuff, they'd come back and they'd hand it out to their friends. And when they handed it to me, they became a big-time drug dealer. Because that's what we labeled them, and that is what stuck, folks. And I would stay in that group until I had every single person in the friendship group. And it was really easy, because these people weren't drug dealers. They weren't making any money on this. They weren't even getting their gas money back. So the person that made the run the first night didn't want to go the next time. It's person B, then person C, person D. And I might be working 10 of those friendship groups simultaneously in different suburbs. So every 2 months, roughly, I would come in with cases on 100 people like this. We'd have a big raid. We'd swoop into their neighborhood at 5 o'clock in the morning, kick down their doors, and drag them out in chains. And when we got them down to the police station, we would have already alerted the media, who would be there with their cameras to take pictures of them in that perp walk and splash them all over their home newspapers, destroying any credibility, any respectability these poor people had in their own neighborhoods. And when we got them all lined up against that back wall, my boss would come out and say to those reporters, "You see this? You see this? There's 100 major drug dealers we took out of your neighborhoods. Major drug dealers. This is the worst thing that's ever happened to America," they would say. "This is going to destroy society as we know it," they would say. And the only thing between you and that destruction is that thin blue line of police. We need more money so we can hire more police. We need bulletproof vests. We need guns with more bullets. We need faster cars and radios. We need harsher laws. We need mandatory minimum sentences. We need 3 strikes, you're out. We need. And the reporters would go away and they would write horror stories, scaring the public to death. And the public would read it and they'd say, "Give it to them. Give it to them." And then we'd go out and do even worse. Let me tell you what would happen to those young people. Every single one of them, this was considered a sale of drugs. Every single one of them was sentenced to 7 years in prison. Now, it was 2.5 years then before they would come out of prison on parole. So 2.5 years after every couple of months I come in with 100 people, another 100 people is coming out of prison. What are they going to do for a living? We snatched them off the streets in the prime of their life when they're trying to get their education. They don't have any education. And even if they did, who was going to hire them? We said they were drug dealers. So you know what they did? They turned right back to the drug culture, the very group we said we were trying to save them from. Only this time they became honest-to-goodness drug dealers. And for every new real drug dealer, you've got to have a whole bunch of new real drug users. So every one of those young people was out there on the streets every day recruiting younger folks to pick up those needles and become the next statistic. And that is how this thing became a self-perpetuating, constantly enlarging policy disaster. And that is why there's no way to fix this. The only way we can do anything about this is end drug prohibition. We have to legalize these drugs, legalize them so we can take them out of the hands of the criminals and end this terrible prohibition gun violence. Once we legalize them, and only after we've legalized them, we can control and regulate them. Today, the control and regulation of these drugs is in the hands of the criminals. They haven't done too good a job for us, right? Once we regulate them, we can do wonderful things. We can end overdose deaths. Nobody has to die of an overdose of drugs. In the 14 years I lived on the streets there, I learned one thing. Nobody died because they shot more and more dope. They died because they simply didn't know how much of that tiny package of powder they were buying was really the drug and how much was the cutting agent. In an unregulated market, they will never know. But we can take this and we can end drug overdoses. Another wonderful thing we can do is we can prevent half of all potential cases of these terrible bloodborne diseases, AIDS and hepatitis C, from ever occurring. Because according to the Centers for Disease Control, 50% of all new cases of AIDS and hepatitis C in this country can be traced directly back to intravenous drug users sharing needles. We can keep a lot of this out of the hands of our children who have told us for the last 30 years it's easier to buy illegal drugs than it is to buy beer and cigarettes. And of course, that's because they get carded. Let's legalize this and let them get carded for heroin, cocaine, and methamphetamine. Make it a little harder for them to get. And lastly, if we legalize these drugs, we won't have to go out as cops and arrest 1.7 million people every year for nonviolent drug offenses. We're destroying America. We've done this for 44 years. We've spent over $1.5 trillion of your tax dollars to do it. And all we have to show for it is this amazing cumulative arrest record. By the end of this year, we will pass 50 million arrests for nonviolent drug offenses. Think of that, 50 million arrests. We got to end this. Thanks.